We and I left Korea in early '52. The 8th Army had been dug in for 6 months as a raider. I'd been spared life in the trenches, so despite the glimpses I'd had of this reality during raider operations in my mind's eye, I still saw the lean, mean, mobile army of the first year of the war racing up and down the peninsula, hardly ever spending 2 nights in the same place, getting our asses kicked and reeling in defeat, or kicking ass and driving the enemy back in resounding victory from the moment I made my decision to return to the... I'd really looked forward to getting back to that sort of fighting. As a result, I was almost totally unprepared for what I found when I got there. My second tour would prove to be a different war upon arrival in Pan. I was sent marching not to my beloved Wolfhounds, but to the former 40th California National Guard Division. It was a heartbreak of the First Order. The 40th had been mobilized in January '51, but sent to Japan to train. It didn't get to Korea for another year. Its members had not seen any combat other than patrol actions and a few company-sized operations, and all of these had only reinforced the unit's reputation as a sorry, undisciplined, ineffective fighting force. Its nickname, the California Crybaby Division, spoke for itself. I just couldn't see myself growing old and telling my children that during the war I'd been a member of such a candy-ass organization. If the truth be known, I didn't intend to stay there even one day. The co at the division's placement company accepted every insult I could dish out about his unit. He calmly explained the Guard was being phased out, and the new CG had asked that every available stud airborne warrior types be assigned to the 40th to give it some muscle, but I didn't want to hear about it. As far as I was concerned, I'd made a contract to return to the Wolfhounds when I volunteered, and I'd been betrayed. I railed my way up the chain of command until the AG received instructions to take me to the Chief of Staff office at the Division Forward Command Post. To my great surprise, I was impressed with what I saw when we got there. The Division CP was shades of Trieste. Everyone and everything dressed right and stood tall. The place actually had an airborne feel. The sparkling clean jeeps were painted that blue-black airborne colour. The perfectly pressed and polished division security platoon wore black lacquered steel pots. It was strictly military and looked more like an 802 airborne unit than the 40th Crybaby Boys. The AG got the first nice words out of me since we'd met. He took the opportunity to tell me the airborne feel was no coincidence that the CG Major General Joseph P. Cleland had come from the 82nd and had brought a number of his airborne people with him, and the AG added it was his impression that General Van Fleet had asked for Cleveland by name to convert the 40th to a regular division. This should have been enough for me, but it wasn't. I could be very stubborn when I wanted to, and to my mind, if God himself had been CG of this unit, I still would have refused to wear the 40th patch. I told Colonel Dillander, the paratrooper chief of staff, just this, and demanded that I be sent to the Lightning Division. No sooner were these words out of my mouth than a small, neat figure with snow-white hair and moustache appeared before me. "Glad you're here, Lieutenant Hackworth. Come inside, would you? I want to have a few words with you." I followed him into his office. He guided me to a chair. "Now why is it you don't want to belong to my outfit?" he asked. The voice was cool and quiet, the complexion smooth, and rosy against the shock of white hair, kind of like Santa Claus. There was a magic twinkle in his eyes, brighter even than the 2 stars on each of his lapels. Major General Joe Cleland, the man who was to become my unsolicited patron, drew up a chair beside me. He listened intently as I told him I was a 27th man, a wolfhound, and that I'd come back to K to fight, not to play nursed to a bunch of NG third-string weekend warriors. Cleland smiled. He knew the Wolfhounds, and he knew what I was talking about. But you have to remember, he told me there are no bad outfits, only bad officers. He said he was now getting his pick of the best, and that the 40th would be exactly what he and his collection of warrior leaders made of it. I could go back to the wall towns, he continued, those merry eyes dancing, but only if I wanted to be in the second-best unit in Korea. Cleland was persuasive, confident, but not manipulative. I knew in my gut he was very much a soldier, and a soldier's soldier at that, so he'd won me hands down even before he said that if I stayed he could do more for me than any other CG in the country. "I'm going to give you a rifle company, Lieutenant, and see you get a damn good chance to fight it." It was the biggest surprise of my 21 years. I spent the night at Division CP at dawn. I awoke to the sounds of running in the Count of Calisthenics. I looked out of the tent to see a superbly fit General Cleland double-timing down the road with members of his staff. Probably half of this bunch were still guard types, fat out of shape, wheezing with every step. But Joe Cleland, 50 years old, if a day led the pack, shaping up the 40th Division from the top. By personal example, the drive from Division to the 223rd Regimental HQ gave me the opportunity to see exactly how far Blitzk had moved to Sitzcrew in this war. Everything seemed to be poured in concrete. Hardy was dug into, stay at regiment itself. There were volleyball courts, snack bars, and officers' clubs and officers' messes. But a matre d' away from the Ritz, it was not just the permanency that struck me, but the attendant luxury. All the goodies were there: nightly movies, well stocked, PXs, starched fatigues, even an outdoor amphitheatre with a stage and row. Beyond row of green sand handbag seats, and all this was within earshot of artillery crashing down on the poor bastards in the trenches. Gibraltar, the rock home of the 223rd, said the sign complacency under canvas. It might have read, I was shocked and actually frightened by this living, breathing example of an army in the defence. Had it been this bad during the raider days? Had I misread the newspapers back at Benning, or read more into them because I so badly wanted to come back? The army I saw now obviously had no intention of attacking, and without that it had no hope of winning. The HQ was an airborne all-the-way mini replica of the 40th Division CP, but from the moment I entered the CP area, I felt that none of it was quite real. The Adjutant Major Doo greeted me as if I were his replacement, rather than a pimply fade lieutenant. The Colonel is waiting to meet you at his quarters, he gushed. I had a chance to have a good look at my new regimental co. while he glanced over my service record. Colonel Lewis Truman was smooth, exceptionally handsome, immaculately dressed in tailored fatigues and infantry blue scarf, manicured from the top of his head to his buffed and clipped fingernails. He had the theatrical presence of Douglas Fairbanks, or maybe that other Douglas MacArthur when we'd met moments before. He hadn't walked up to greet me, he'd glided. He hadn't talked, he'd purred. Yes, Lieutenant, the old man rang me. Gave you the highest recommendation, he wants you to have a rifle company. He was still purring as he made small talk over my record. A lot of Combat 4, Purple Hearts, excellent background. Then came the hook. You've known the General before. I should have said he was my father. And I, his bastard son Cleveland, must have given me one hell of an introduction. Now this good politician before me, it was all becoming clear, wanted to know how deep the connection was, how it might affect him. I couldn't imagine the story about Truman was that he was the president's nephew, and a guy couldn't get much more clout than that the colonel then briefed me on the regiment it was in reserve, and like the rest of the division phasing out the guard and assimilating new replacements, the unit had the numbers, but not the experience. It was suffering from an acute shortage of tried Andrew Nokos and qualified junior officers at company level. Most COSOs had less than 2 years' service. Platoon leaders less than 1. That's why Cand was trying like hell to get seasoned people. And why, explained Truman, we're so glad to have you aboard, so glad to have you aboard. I looked around for the gangplank so I could jump ship about. This time Major Arthur Heyman, the regimental operations officer fresh out of the 82nd 2, glided in. Maybe he took lessons from Truman. Colonel, he said, hate to bother you, but this is hot, that's how they talked. Cliché after cliché with a kind of manufactured urgency. Soon Hyman glided out again. The plans for the next morning's hot training exercise. Burning holes through his hands, enter Adjutant Doe, who had a hurried whisper with the colonel before exiting stage right. Truman turned back to me with sympathetic, doleful eyes. Lieutenant, there is no rifle company command position available in the regiment, but what we can do is assign you to the 1st Battalion as Co. of D Company, heavy weapons. I thought, great, the minute I walk out of this room, I'm going back to division and get on my pony for the Wolfhounds. But Truman read my thoughts. You understand, Lieutenant, this is just a stopgap position. You will get the 1st Rifle Company that opens up in the regiment. In the meantime, I think the experience will be good for you. Notice you've only had Rifle Company experience. This will round out your career, so to speak. so to speak. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Young down at First Bat was a poor imitation of Colonel Truman. He wore the same tailored fatigues, the same infantry scarf, but everything was a bit wrinkled and nothing seemed to fit quite right. Young explained that the battalion was training hard and would go online in about 5 weeks. As he gave me a rundown on Company D's strengths and shortcomings, I was struck with the strongest feeling that this CE didn't know what he was talking about, like a professor of mechanical engineering who knows the language but has never seen a motor or had grease on his hands. That's how this guy was with the jargon of infantry. Or so it appeared to me. I gave myself a good talking to as I left his office. After all, Young was a light colonel of infantry. He was probably very qualified to run this outfit. Maybe I was just used to rough cob skippering battalions. Young was just different, as Truman was so different from Sloan. And maybe it was my own anxiety about taking over a company. I'd never expected such an opportunity. I hadn't thought I had enough experience now. It was obvious, at least in a comparative sense, that I did. But what a place to do it in all green guys, in an all-green regiment. No famous heritage like the Wolfhounds to build a spree upon. When a spree was probably the only win-lose factor left in this war, my new charges, whatever unit I ended up with, would probably be most unrayed. Likely they'd have read the papers. Surely they'd know the peace talks were ongoing, even at a snail's pace, and all would be waiting for the breakthrough. None wanting to be the last casualty in a no-win war. It was a hell of a big leadership problem. How would I motivate these guys, fire them up for the big game, when all they'd want to do would be hide in their bunkers and hope they'd make it until it was time to go home? As it turned out, I had far fewer problems with my men than I did with Colonel Young. I lasted in his command just over a month. Our first confrontation was over what Young considered my unorthodox supply procedures. Ammunition was rationed for training. But when my supply sergeant found a rock supply depot that would swap us ammo for C rations, the raider in me logically told him to go for it. Sure, it was irregular. As a matter of fact, it was totally illegal. The rocks would no doubt sell the Cs on the black market, but I didn't care. My job was to knock these troops. Only about 50% were NG now, but that was plenty to keep the outfit bopping along more like a fraternity than a military unit into shape with heavy-duty hands-on training. And if I could do just one thing, it would be to make damn sure that when I went on to Truman's promised rifle company, these guys in the rear would be proficient. To relieve another unit on the line, I was pretty confident that my D Company charges wouldn't do too much damage on the battlefield, except where it counted and the rifle company commanders, and I went forward a few days early to plan and recon the relief, as the heavy weapon co-I was responsible for the battalion fire plan. When I first got this job, I'd set a copy of the Heavy Weapons Field Manual and begun reading up, almost wishing I'd paid more attention at Benning when we discussed the functioning of a heavy weapons company. But I hadn't given it any thought at the time I saw myself as a frontline infantryman. Heavy weapons had seemed like rear echelon crap to my mind. They still were, but if I had to be a rear echelon commando, I was determined to be the best rear echelon commando, and had studied long and hard at night, and on the job to this end. Now on the line, my task was first to establish interlocking bands of grazing fire across the battalion front, then to cover dead spots with indirect fire starting with D Company's mortars, and finally to deploy the principally anti-tank recoilless rifles to cover tank and infantry approaches. I walked along the front, selecting my sights and alerting the rifle company Kossos so they could plan to shift their own weapons as necessary. Heavy weapons had priority of sights in that the interlocking bands of fire had to tie in with the battalions on either side. As part of a red-proof line that stretched the whole way across Korea, all went well, until one of the company coups refused to shift a bar to make way for a heavy machine gun section. We got into an argument which heated up a la Sergeant Reeves back in G Company, to the point where we were ready to duke it out. Reason came to my aid at the last moment. The CEO had a chip on his shoulder the size of a mortar tube. He was a short guy with a runt complex, and I decided to let the battalion commander intervene after I finished my deployment plan. I left the line and headed back to Colonel Young. I told him the story and requested did he talk to the CO. Young rubbed his hands together like the worried old bookkeeper he was, and said it's Charlie's area, he knows what's best. Colonel, we're talking about an integrated fire plan, right out of FM 715. I took the field manual out of my jacket and thumped it on his desk. It's quite pointless to argue. Lieutenant, look, I will read from the book, I replied, and read the thing, chapter and verse. I slammed the field manual down again, so it has no goddamned bearing on whose area it's in. Heavy weapons has priority of sights. Lieutenant, I suggest you not use profanity in my presence. That was the absolute limit. I blew up, Colonel. You can take this battalion and stuff it right up your arse after 40 days in this wishy-washy unit. I'm convinced you could not run a good Boy Scout troop with that. I saluted, whirled around, and stormed out. It all had to do with a deep moral feeling on my part. The book could play with it, make it better based on your own experience, but on basic tactical matters it held proven principles for success that had evolved from a lot of wars over a lot of years. I should have realized Colonel Finance wouldn't know this. He probably didn't know an M1 from an adding machine, on the other hand. Maybe I had realized it and I'd just been looking for a final shootout. But I think what pissed me off even more was that the guy did not have the guts to stand tall during a fight between two subordinates. I decided I was right, morally right, and army right, but that Truman would not know this. The last thing I needed now was to blow my top at the regimental co too. I was already worried about what had said to Young. Not that it wasn't true, but it was just not the way one addressed his co. I went straight to General Cleland and told him what happened. He agreed with me on the tactical end of things. As for my tact, he was less impressed. In fact, he chewed my arse royally with much fire in his voice. He said I needed to learn patience, respect for my superiors, and most important, control over my temper. I agreed down the line, but told him it was hard. I'd learned in 1950 that war was a serious game. People died in it. But guys like Young didn't seem to know this, and it seemed that the Youngs were in charge wherever I looked. Sometimes Hackworth, the general, replied, "It's better to be like the three monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. The army is changing. You must do the best you can, even while you're changing with it." Before I left, he called Truman. A rifle company had miraculously opened a chup in 2nd Bat. Cleland assured me that the old airborne co-bill Locke was my kind of soldier. "You'll be online in a couple of days, son," he concluded as he walked me to the door. "Good luck, take care of yourself, and watch that temper." I returned to Company D, packed my gear, and split with no regrets. To my great relief, there were no repercussions from my blow-up at Colonel Young, or so I thought. His last laugh came long after he'd been killed in Korea on the reverse slope of a company sector. He'd taken the opportunity to render an officer efficiency report on me, a form I'd never paid much mind to in Easy or the Raiders for my short tenure in his command. The words impetuous and immature on that ER. An accurate assessment, I had to admit, were to sting my arse in a big way for almost a decade to come. I arrived at the 2nd Bat CP, and for the first time really knew I'd soon be back on the line. Everyone was moving briskly, packing up and getting ready to go. A rush of adrenaline ran through me, long dormant, that familiar buzz which resonates in your gut all the time. You're in combat awoke with a start. I like the feeling. I also like this place. Precise, neat military Young's battalion had looked good too, but there it seemed the precision was all for show, a just-in-case exactness, as if to prevent God, or at least General Cleland, from suddenly swooping down and catching the outfit short. Here the exactness was organic. It thrived on itself. No one seemed to be looking over his shoulder for higher command's approval. Dick Whedon, the battalion adjutant, told me the colonel was up front on a recon. I filled the time processing in and being briefed on battalion SOPs and the operational readiness of Fox Company. My new command at one point, the battalion, so Major Charles Brown took me aside to tell me Colonel Locke was one mean hombre. The worst-tempered, toughest guy he'd ever worked for. Brown would know he was a hard old warrior himself, wounded 3 times in World War II. And I began to wonder if maybe I should have stayed with Colonel Young a bit later. Whedon said the old man was back and would meet me in the battalion mess. I went in. No colonel, a small thin captain wearing Medical Service Corps insignia and a Korean Military Assistance Group K patch walked in as the mess was about to close. I decided not to wait any longer and ate with him. We made the usual small talk, and then he started asking me what I thought of the 40th Division, what I'd heard about 2nd Bat, really strange questions that started my sixth sense screaming, why would an overage in grade MSc KMAG captain give a damn about this division or this battalion? Maybe he and the colonel were pals. Hell, the guy was so old. Maybe his only friend in the world was the colonel. So I answered his questions, but in a very guarded kind of way. About this time, Whedon came in. Oh, he said, I'm glad you found each other. Have you been introduced to the Colonel, Lieutenant Hackworth? Not only was this Colonel Lochme, he was very, very sneaky. My new CEO dismissed his trick with a shrug, saying he'd forgotten about his recon disguise like hell. I thought the minute his disguise was dropped, he got down to business with the most colourful vocabulary I'd ever heard. The scuttlebutt was that Locke had been a mule skinner in the old horse Calav. All that was certain was he did swear. Like one poor old George Washington must have been rolling in his grave in July 1776. He'd issued an order to the Continental Army that swearing that unmeaning and abominable custom was forever banned. The order still stood in 1952. General Washington of all people should have known that. One must never issue an order that cannot be enforced. Colonel Locke was old army through and through. The word was he'd risen to top KCK before the war, then was battlefield commissioned, while with Merrill's Marauders in Burma since 1945, he'd served with the 82nd as Battalion Co and Regimental XO. The man was mean as a snake and looked like one too. A rattler about to strike, he was thin, almost bald, with a long face and thin, tight lips. He mashed together like Humphrey Bogart. He chewed tobacco, had a stain from it on his cheek, and his teeth were ground down like an old whore's. He also minced no words. He said the battalion was locked, cocked, and ready to go. We would go forward in the morning coordinate with the outfit we were to relieve, stay 24 hours to get the lay of things, and returned to our unit from Locke's point of view. The terms of my own employment were simple, if I messed up. I was out then, having made himself so succinctly and painfully clear. He rose to leave his last unsmiling words, "Welcome to the 2nd Battalion." Whedon was pleased I'd gotten along so well with the colonel. Though it was news to me now, I understood the flawless condition of his unit. He ran it on pure fear. His men had no time to worry about surprise visits from Cleveland. They had enough on their plates just watching out for their mule skinner Co-Fox Company had talent untried. But it was there the platoon leaders were West Pointer 51, Joe Rice Rock grad Joe Stokes, and Boyd Guttery, an AG man doing his infantry stint. None had more than 12 months troop experience to bring to his platoon, yet instinctively I knew each was a good man, eager and bright in a few months with lots of work. They'd be studs on the battlefield as their fledgling company commander. Though my biggest concern was, who was going to hold their hands through the worst of it? Normally, green lieutenants leaned on their old sergeants until the realities of combat caught up with their West Point OCS or Rock Book. Learning the problem in Fox and across the front was that the US Army had totally run out of NCOs. I had to put 2 corporals Thelbert Allison and OCS dropout Homer Smith in platoon sergeant positions. These jobs were normally held by master sergeants, but even my top kick Gregory was only a staff sergeant whose complete infantry experience had been as a company clerk. Somewhere along the line, my saving grace in the unit was actually a PFC named Herschel Hudson, whom I assigned to round out the rifle platoon. Sergeant team, the HUD was a platoon sergeant who'd re-enlisted for Korea. All in all, I had a good team, though it looked as if officer and NCO would be leaning on each other for the next little while. My own job was already shaping up to be not just commander, but chief instructor. I got the company together to give them my I am your new co-talk and set in motion a training program for the period I was on recon. In this respect, I did not feel daunted by the number of men. 200, I was now responsible for the 2-day 40-hour crash course, would concentrate on the same basics battle drill night, defence procedures, field fortifications, and night relief I taught and reinforced in my George squads of 11 and the Easy and Raider platoon of 40 to 50. I set up a relief rehearsal for the night I returned with that my recon party cut off our 40th div patches, taped over the unit markings on our vehicles, and slipped up to the line. The first thing that struck me was that if a unit is a reflection of its commander, then First Lieutenant Joe Love, skipper of George Company, 5th Regimental Combat Team, the unit Fox would be relieving, was one of the best I'd seen in Korea. Love was a tall, handsome Southern charmer, West Point class of 50, and a total pro in a no-win war where defeat and counting days, until Daros date-eligible return from overseas, had grabbed hold of the boys in the trenches in rolling tides, as poisonous as mustard gas. Love ran a high-spirited, enthusiastic outfit. He did credit to the 5th RCT, one of the hard-fighting sister regiments of the Wolfhounds in the Hawaiian days, from range cards to hill weapons to fire plans. George Company was ready the same, unfortunately could not be said for the position. It wasn't Joe's fault the worst of the place had been thrown up more than a year before when SE Friedus set in, and George Company hadn't been there long enough to make major fixes. The place was a maze, and in bad repair, bunkers were falling apart all over the hill, their sandbags bursting from age and shell hits, the supporting log beam sagging from initially bad design and worse construction. The fighting positions were badly laid out. They'd been thrown up on top of the barren hill, like little forts. Most had terrible fields of fire. Not only could the Weep not reach down to get grazing fire, but one good enemy SP or MG across the valley could slam rounds right into the bunker's fring ports and close them down. It was a wonder they were still there, especially when you looked at the junkyard in front of the position. The wire barrier had been as badly laid out as the fighting line, and as sadly neglected along its helter-skelter barbed wire apron eye. The whole thing was just a broken-down hodgepodge of stakes, concertina wire, and mines thrown up or buried by one generation of fenders after another. I'd seen it all before with the raiders, but somehow it was different now when I realized I'd have to live there, and of course there was no doubt the frontline dilapidation had continued most enthusiastically in the months I'd been away. As usual, there were no barrier maps. Where are the mines was. The logical question out there with a broad sweep of the arm was the standard reply I couldn't understand. The positions had been there 1 year, they'd been occupied by elements of 4 different divisions, and it seemed as though not a damn thing had been done to improve them. They were death traps, nothing more or less. And who's kidding whom, I wondered. As I headed back to Fox the next moment, the fighters knew the truth, but maybe the generals really believed the story. They fed the politicians that the 8th Army defence was an impregnable line in depth, but depth meant good defensive positions behind the main line that were or could be occupied by soldiers in a snap. Our D was snack bars, volleyball courts, and the regimental Greek theatre. Those perfect green sandbag seats belonged on the line. It was criminal. The only depth we had was out front, 2 fortified half squad ops 1 aride each major avenue of approach, and both death traps. I'd already decided to change LPS and patrols, but they were not depth. Their function was security to delay the enemy and provide early warning, and to deceive the enemy as to where the defence was, yet the ladder was hardly possible given the big forts we had sitting astride the trench line like Humpty Dumpty on a wall. Well, I thought Humpty Dumpty's going to have his great fall if we don't get it together in a big hurry. That night Fox did a slow walk-through rehearsal of the night. Relief patience had never been one of my strong points, and I saw it slipping. Now the rehearsal was by no means a disaster, but it was painfully clear that my boys could barely go through the motions. God only knew what they'd done in training, but they were not ready for the big game. I realized then it was going to be a question of just getting them on the hill. The front line was no place to train, but there was no alternative. I had fledgling architects when what we needed were gnarled old carpenters. I just prayed we'd have time to forge a fighting team before the enemy blew our house down. After the rehearsal, I met with the leaders and issued my order. Simplicity was the word. We would follow the book company assembly point to platoon assembly points to squad release points to filling in the line next to Joe Love's fine soldiers. As each Fox platoon leader took over, Joe's relieved force would reverse the procedure, and finally they would slip off the hill. The troops were so green I wondered whether we should lock and load. I finally decided that the weapons would be loaded, but with no rounds in the chambers, and there'd be no firing without an officer's approval. Win war, which like Korea would gut the army of its very fibre. Its NCOs, the 40th Division, was deployed on the east coast near a large valley called the Punchball. The right flank of the division was on the Punchbowl's northern rim, linking up with other units to form a human wall stretching from coast to coast. Fighter Company's defensive sector started on a high hill where we tied in with easy. We had the Topper ridgeline sweeping up from the valley floor. On this eastern edge of our position was a company-sized enemy avenue of approach. Right into my 3rd platoon, the sector ran downhill into a draw, then up another hill to our west. About 100 yards, where we tied in with George Company. The draw led into the valley, widening as it went, and by the time it hit the valley floor it was wide enough to take almost 2 enemy battalions. AB Brest called the Gap. It was a most dangerous regimental avenue of approach, and it didn't take much to see, and it was recognised the whole way from army to corps to division regiment battalion, and especially to me that fighter held the critical ground to overrun the Punchbowl. The enemy would have to strike through my position if they secured the high knob. My left flank it would be smooth sailing, walking or rolling. The draw was also a good tank, avenue of approach from there, right through the gap to the flatlands behind it. Was not a great place for a green regiment. My tasks were many, and competed in priority. Holding the hill and keeping the boys alive were the key governing factors. Trolls had to go out, and the men had to be trained. But keeping them alive also meant an immediate rebuild of the breastworks and the solving of a serious field sanitation problem. Rats fed off the enemy dead on the wire as well as on any food they found on position and infested every bunker. Some were as long as an arm. I worried about hemorrhagic fever, a killer disease, the first sign of which was the whites of the eyes going red with blood, like someone had given them a good poke. I remembered Uncle Roy telling me about the big influenza epidemic that roared through Europe in 1918. More people died at the end from the flu than were knocked off by shot. But as far as I was concerned, in the Psych Korean trenches of 1952, one was no worse than the other, be it a slug or a bug that got him. I'd still be losing a valuable soldier. The bunkers were death traps, not just because of their high profiles, but because they were too heavily built easily, 20,000 sandbags. To many of them the men piled the sandbags on, like the Crusaders had piled on armour, but the sandbags weakened the heavy wooden timbers, and just like the Crusaders who became so heavily protected they couldn't even stand up to face the enemy. Soldiers across the front were being crushed to death, or mangled when a direct hit or heavy rain caused their sandbagged bunkers to collapse on top of them. Did justice to his West Point military engineering degree by designing a sleek, low-profile fighting bunker. We figured each platoon could manage one rebuild per night, the troops filling sandbags and chow bunkers on the reverse slope, unobserved by the enemy by day, so come nightfall. The bunker building would be a simple assembly job, with all materials pre-stocked at the same time. The op in front of 3rd Platoon would be relocated and rebuilt, while the one at the gap would be abandoned and booby-trapped. I decided to replace this one with a 2-man roving op whose members could provide early warning and high-tail at home. I ordered rat poison by the ton and no care package food on the hill. I abolished the practice of throwing empty SE ration cans, a rodent delicacy, in front of the trench, and had the enemy dead burned off the wire with napalm. The wire itself would be upgraded when the weather changed. We'd have a slightly better chance of working through the uncharted AP mines without blowing ourselves up when the ground was frozen hard, and whenever all this was completed, we'd rebuild the reverse slope bunkers. I woke up on 4th November 1952, thinking that a year had passed since that terrible night on Hill 400. What had it been for, I wondered. The month of November 52nd saw the heaviest fighting of the past year, with US casualties up to 1,000 a week. The peace talks dragged on and on, while troopers on the ground still sat on death row, waiting for a reprieve that never came. More firepower air, and arty had now officially been used in Korea than in all of World War II. Fighter was catching hundreds of incoming rounds a day, mostly mortars and howitzers. The thing that always got to me was that while pound for pound we had the enemy incredibly outgunned, they had none of the good stuff. We had no tactical barbed wire or minefields or teak air. It didn't stop them from nickel and dimming us literally. Around the clock, their artillery was burrowed corkscrew fashion into the hillside. Sometimes on tracks the guns would be pulled up along the track to their firing positions. poop out a few rounds and then be slid back. Like the Chinese, the North Koreans needed a lot of pre-planning to concentrate heavy fire in support of a specific operation, and lousy KO made them inflexible once the show got on the road. Still, we'd been online less than a week and had taken a couple of WIA every day, mostly from direct artillery hits that ripped into the bunkers. Joe Rice had a round slam through 3 layers of sandbags and split the 14-inch logs in the roof right over his head as he lay dozing in his bunker one afternoon. Luckily, it didn't go off a lot of dirt, but no problem, he said. About 20% of all incoming, much of it old Soviet ammo, were duds. But tell that to your heart as you sat listening to the whine, the whistle and the crunch about 1 round's worth every 3 minutes across the company front. Fortunately, US artillery was responsive, accurate and plentiful during this period. The emphasis on it pretty well, a whole new ball game compared to my last 2 was, I figured, based on Napoleon's concept of depending on firepower when the infantry is weak. God knows we were piss weak. So the arty, historically the do-foot's best friend, was ours too in this old-style trench war by the Eath Day online. I was exhausted. I hadn't clocked too many hours of sleep since we arrived. Little did I know it would be that way the whole time we were in this sector, which came to be known simply as the Gap. There was always something to fix or rebuild, always someone to train. It amazed me how much there was to do at platoon level. I'd somehow come to assume that on a day-to-day level we were the ones doing the work, while the company commander just sat back and took it easy until the operation warning order came. How very wrong I'd been the respect I'd had for M. Gilchrist. And Evans only grew as I came to appreciate the heavy responsibility and the great demands of a job they'd performed so well. Still, the work in fighter was worth the effort. Our position and our people were looking better and better. We were becoming a company in spirit and proficiency, as well as in fact the patrols were already meeting with some success. In the first week, men of fighter killed 6 North Koreans with no casualties of our own. Our first enemy probe, which occurred near where the 3rd Platoon Op was being rebuilt, was also nipped in the bud, despite the fact that the North Koreans were at their finest, at probes with specially trained sappers for whom patience was a strong point. The sappers would crawl along on their bellies, snipping their way with cloth between their cutters' teeth, which muffled the metallic click through minefields laced with booby traps, flares, and barbed wire entanglements, and be in your position without your hearing one sound. But Joe Stokes, platoon leader of the 3rd, had wisely placed an out-G guard on a knob 100 yards from the op to provide the work detail with security, and a squad of North Koreans walked right into them. It was total surprise all round, but the final result was no friendly casualties, and 3 more enemy Kia little kills like these did wonders for morale. And even more important, they dispelled the rumours that the North Koreans were 10-foot-tall monsters roving through the valley like Frankensteins. I spent many daylight hours out in my observation post-op studying the battlefield. Joe Love had rebuilt this critical facility. It was a first-class command centre that allowed a good view of the entire company front, plus a clear view of No Name Hill, the grim enemy-held fortress dominating our immediate battle area. This was my battle station in it. I worked out fighters' flash fires, complete defensive barges of mixed artillery mortars and flares pre-arranged and codenamed with my artillery foe from it. I would initially control my unit during an enemy attack at night. I worried my fledgling patrols through their paces, as if they were my sons out with the family car for the first time. I'd gone on a few patrols myself to help the boys through their opening night jitters, but as the company co really had no business being out there in no man's land, and with great reluctance I now remained in the trenches and lent moral support. The self-exile had certain advantages, though if nothing big was happening like a patrol getting lost, which in the early days happened with painful regularity, I'd walk the front line from end to end a couple of times. I'd check each position, talked to the troops until I got to know their names and could recognize their voices in the dark, and give quiet, impromptu classes on everything from weapons maintenance to leadership to how to stop homesickness. "Hey sir, when's the mail coming?" kids would ask again and again. I'd take a hike out to the 3rd Platoon outpost, which was under construction. I'd have a look at the rebuilding and then just sit there thinking, if I were the enemy, so how would I attack this position? I did the same thing down at the Gap. Then I would war game all the options. How would I maneuver? Where would I set up my supporting weapons? What would be my main attack when I penetrated? How would I roll up the flanks? Out of all this pondering night after night came our defensive organization and local counter-attack plans every time. I walked the line. I'd find troopers asleep. Sleeping on the front was a court-martial offence. One snoozer weakens the whole defence, but I didn't believe in court-martials. There's more than one way to keep people awake, and I preferred the old Army NCO way company procedure required anyone coming up the trench to be softly challenged. Halt, who goes there? No challenge generally meant the trooper was asleep, or at least not doing his job. I'd sneak up and toss the guy on the trench or bunker. He'd wake up with my trench knife against his throat. If I were a North Korean, you'd be one dead son of a, then I'd bring in the chain of command. So every responsible leader got into the ACT I'd call in the kid squad and platoon leaders, and on the spot have them explain why he was sleeping, but I knew why a lot of troopers could sleep all day long and still not off on the line. It was their escape. Many were so damn scared they'd fall asleep just to make it all go away. But sleepers placed the rest of my soldiers at unnecessary risk, so alertness became top priority. NOCOS and officers started patrolling their sectors like cops on a beat. This cut the number of sleeping incidences way down, but there were still too many offenders. Finally, I came up with the ultimate punishment. Habitual sleepers would man the outposts. Nobody would dare screw off there. It's only fair to say that from time to time I fell victim to the Sandman too. One night, during the first week, I done my walk through the position and returned to my CP running on empty, afraid to even grab a catnap in case something happened and I'd be too foggy to deal with it. I sat down on my ammo box and air mattress bed. I couldn't lie down. Lying down meant instant sleep should have kept Joe Love's KO wire contraption. I thought as lit another cigarette that bed virtually guaranteed sleepless nights. I chain-smoked from the minute I came inside the CP, and between the smoke and the heat from our little squad stove, my bloodshot eyes were beginning to sag. I got up and poured my millionth cup of black coffee, which had been reheated for about the 2 millionth time since dinner. I sat down again, thinking that my breath would kill an elephant, and closed my eyes. I awoke with a fright. The sun was just rising. Atkins, my key/operation. Sergeant appeared at the doorway. "What's happening with the patrol?" He gave me a puzzled look. "Sir, you brought it in an hour ago." Atkins had thought I'd been resting my eyes the whole time I'd been sitting there. He'd been bopping in and out saying stuff like, "The patrol is at checkpoint red. Shall I move it according to plan to checkpoint blue?" Apparently each time I'd pondered the question and then issued clear instructions, but I had no recall sound asleep. I just moved the patrol all over no man's land and home again, not cool from that moment onward. I made Atkins have me on my feet every time I gave such instructions. In the meantime, I thought with great misgivings, all's well that ends well, and wondered if I should assign myself to op duty too. A couple of the most recent YIAs were mine. We got an extra ration of incoming. The day they did their tallying and the night of the 10th 3rd Platoon was caught in a 20-minute torrential downpour of accurate MG fire from no name, mixed with the usual mortar and artillery fire. It started inexplicably and stopped just as quickly. We tended to our wounded and all was quiet the 11th. My birthday was a day like every other, only a bit colder at dusk. My patrolmen were chomping at the bit, waiting for the shot of first dark to send them dashing off to the valley floor. This is how the war went during the day. Both great armies lived underground, hoping not to get knocked off by the unrelenting bursts of artillery and mortar fire. Coming from across the way, at night the war moved into the valley, where small, lightly equipped patrols hunted each other down in no man's land. The key to the ambush patrols was to beat the Reds down to the choice ambush positions. Most sites like the Pines, a favourite just north of the Gap where the boys were going tonight, were no bigger than a city parking lot with only limited places to set up the patrol, would then set up a killing zone with all-round security in the hope, ideally of taking a prisoner before dawn's first light. Accepting the work of US Raider-type units to date the enemy had been far craftier and usually more successful at this sort of operation than the average American Deutsch BAS. Basically, this was because among the other good things the North Koreans were lacking was rotation and insidious system that caused us troopers to pay more attention to counting days than fighting Reds, and to make not even the slightest attempt to get to know the lay of the land a crucial element in staying ahead in this war. The North Koreans, on the other hand, knew every fold and wrinkle of the battlefield, as well as a game warden knows his reserve. They'd been there since the beginning, and they'd be there for the duration, unless they went out feet first. This fact alone gave them a decided advantage, the motivation for taking the job seriously. Dark came and out went the patrol. I'd stay in my CP ready to pour in the supporting fires until the men reached their lay-up position. I thought about Colonel Locke, who'd paid his daily visit that morning. That was the only I had about the great, relatively safe road network that ran behind our position as a result of it. We got hots for breakfast and dinner, no complaints there, but we also got many too many sightseers. Every visiting fireman seemed to come to fight her mainly because we were so accessible, completely destroying any chance of sleep during the day. The road ran but a few steps from RCP, and out of the jeeps they'd hop fat politicians in new green fatigues and high mook orcs complete with entourage from regiment, division, corps and army directly into a well-constructed bunker. They take a quick look at the enemy positions from my op pile back into their vehicles and get to the rear just in time. I assumed for happy hour Locke's visits, however, were somewhat different. He usually walked the trenches before coming to the CP, casting his old army eyes over everyone and everything hearts. Throughout the company would freeze with fear it took till the next morning to thaw them out, and by then he was on his way up the line again. He was an odd guy. Lock his attention to discipline and exacting detail. No doubt saved a lot of lives, but I didn't agree, nor would I ever. That fear was the only way to get results this morning. For some reason the troops had been spared. The colonel had come directly to the CP and flopped down on my rack. How he was able to do this without wrinkling his starched, immaculate uniform. I'd never know we talked about the company, the battalion, and the other world out there. I'd been amazed at how cynical he was then. As usual, we'd taken a walk down the long tunnel that led to my op. About halfway, there was a small step down, and as usual I'd said, "Now watch your step, Colonel." He'd missed the step, which was also, as usual, thumped his head on a supporting beam and cut loose with the foulest T8 imaginable in my direction. "You goddamn rotten son of a gun bastard of a pissant lieutenant. Why don't you fix that goddamn step that had been just the start?" And as usual, Lock assessment of Fighter's old man was broadcast for miles to both friend and foe alike. I just yes sired and no sired until the barrage slowed down, only then reminding him as usual about the 2-ton rock that lived under the step, and that to modify the tunnel fell into the category of building the Hoover Dam. Thinking about it now, I had to laugh. Lock had skinned his head this morning. Pretty soon his skull would be as worn down as his teeth. The patrol reported in from the first checkpoint negative, nothing in the pines, at least not yet, and no enemy in sight. Then, just as I was about to leave the CP, a huge wall of enemy fire crashed over the company sector from end to end. I ran to my op. It looked like the 4th of July out there, with artillery mortar and direct fire, MGS blazing in the meanest barrage I'd ever seen. I called for all flash fires to lock our position in. If we were getting hit, the enemy attack force would be out in the open. Now we could smash them with our counter-wall of fire. The platoon had flipped on their radios. All reported heavy incoming, but no ground attack, though 3rd Platoon Leader Joe Stokes had lost contact with his outpost. He said he'd send some people out to check on it as soon as the worst of the present barrage ceased. In the meantime, our patrol at the Pines had seen no enemy movement. I told these men to sit tight and try to avoid making contact. I only wanted one ball game at a time. Stokes reported contact infantry force size unknown on his reverse slope. They weren't in his trench line. He'd had no penetration and didn't know where they'd come from. The other platoon still had no contact when I called Locke with a sitrep. He said E Company had been penetrated, which at least answered the question of where the North Koreans were coming from. But it had been a damn gutsy manoeuvre on the enemy's part. They had to have come up right through their supporting fires. I had our foe lift the defensive fire everywhere along the company front, except 3rd Platoon, and I took. Off for Stokes's position in their first real fight, my boys, God bless them, were cool, alert and professional. Squad and platoon leaders moved back and forth, checking their positions. Troops challenged. Me right down the line, we passed through 2nd Platoon and entered 3rd Platoon's trenches. It was a whole different scene at the top of the hill. Total panic, the boys had bunched up, leaving large areas of the trench. Abandoned mortar and artillery fire was still raining down. MG slugs were stitching the top layer of sandbags. The Humpty Dumpty bunkers that hadn't yet been rebuilt were taking fire right through the apertures. The guys inside were pinned down and couldn't return fire. I suddenly realized that was what the barrage the previous night had been all about. The North Koreans had been zeroing clever bastards. I ran over to the E Company tie-in point. The penetration had come at E's first fighting bunker. Enemy tracks in the wet ground ran right over the top of it. My guys got themselves together and sealed the penetration. We could hear a good firefight raging on the reverse slope near Stokes's CP. No one had a clue as to how many bad guys were down there. But at least now they had no way out. I went inside the E Company bunker, only to find a certified frontline recreation centre. A poncho was over the aperture, candles were burning magazines, and playing cards were strewn all over the place, and in the middle of it all were the bodies of 2 Americans who died having fun on the firing line. Stokes appeared steady and very much in control. In his first big firefight, he was a good man. Joe Stokes, I'd liked him from day one. He'd graduated from Oklahoma A&M in agriculture, the year after Barney K. Neal. His father had destroyed his dreams of turning their panhandle plot into a prosperous farm by finding oil all over the joint. Stokes had actually been disappointed, now he reported in with his dry sense of humour, that Koreans were still alive and well on the reverse slope, but being contained and whittled down to size with a dozen enemy dead already, he said there were no friendly Kia, but at least 10 wounded, and he'd still had no word from the op. I told him to clean up the reverse slope. I'd go down to the op myself as soon as the incoming lightened up. Stokes moved out, while I directed the weapon platoon leader to get tank recoilless rifle and 50 cal fire onto No Name to shut off the goddamned MG fire still ripping right into the position, and I organised a squad of Stokes's people under PFC Lindemann, a great former IST Cav combat man. We picked up as a replacement to check on the op. I finally had a chance to touch base with my CP. The patrols still had no contact. I told Atkins to return these men to the main line and have Joe Rice meet them at the patrol gate in front of his platoon. No doubt the boys below would be a little trigger-happy with so much action just up the ridge. But if Rice was out there, he'd make damn certain that weapons AED locked and the patrol not be chopped up by jittery friendlies in the middle of all this. Lindemann appeared with a struggling Katusha and dropped him at my feet. This little bastard was on the op. He saw the enemy coming and bugged out. The Katusha was crying everyone under poncho every night, one guard, same me. I see enemy come. I run away. The rage built up so fast I didn't know what I was doing. Stuck in the trench wall was an M1 cleaning rod, all metal, without thinking. I grabbed it and lashed out at the Korean. I picked him up and threw him over the trench. He'd lead us through the bullets to the op, and whipped him with that cleaning rod until he got his cowardly, weaponless arse moving. It was another page in the continuing unfortunate saga of the Kusas. Through attrition, their numbers had dwindled as the war dragged on, and they'd become less and less effective as their untrained ranks continued to be integrated into American units, leading naturally to more and more resentment among their US counterparts. It wasn't until a short time after this fight when I put all the Koreans in one unit under a great little Korean liaison. Sergeant-turned-line NCO named Chung, and got results that finally understood how much of the damn problem was the Yanks themselves. Most American leaders had given up trying to communicate with the Qs, except through sign language more often than not. Obscene and name-calling the war had made all the UN troops cannon fodder, but the Kusas were treated like subhuman cannon fodder. The Americans came and went every 9 months. It was the Qs who stayed on these slopes for the duration, and as time passed, we the Americans were the ones who, through the continued introduction of Green M, and in most cases even greener officers, were becoming increasingly less proficient in our trade. It should have been little wonder that the South Korean soldiers were cool cunning, and more adept at keeping their heads down than joining in the fray. No wonder in a jam that they'd save their own asses and not their US buddies, but I was too mad to think about that now. We arrived at the outpost to find 2 men dead bayoneted and their throats slit. The third man, Haley, was missing, and the enemy long gone. The op had been taken by stealth and surprise. There were no spent cartridges to be seen, just long grey ashes from cigarettes that hadn't died as quickly as their smokers. A poncho lay crumpled at the bottom of the hole, a picture worth 1,000 words. Haley and the 2K had been sleepers. I'd ordered Stokes to make them permanent op until they got there together. They must have thought school was out when they covered the foxhole with that poncho and lit up. I spent the rest of the night with Lindemann and his squad searching for the missing man in no man's land. We went all the way down to the valley floor, which was still being pulverized by US artillery fire, but Haley was nowhere to be seen. Fresh tracks gave us the first clue as to the size of the raiding enemy. Force 2, maybe 3 platoon. Then it was getting light, so we gave up the search, and with heavy hearts moved back to the op to pick up the dead and take them to our lines. By the time I got back to 3rd platoon, the enemy dead had been searched, and neatly stacked like sacks of potatoes. The North Koreans had put on a good show. Even if they'd lost 24 men, they'd knocked off the op and taken a prisoner. They'd sneaked up the hill and slipped right through the weakest and most critical point in a defensive position, the tie-in point between 2 separate units, and swept undetected over the reverse slope. Only now did I find it was just the North Koreans' bad luck that 10 of Stokes's men were leaving a sleeping bunker to relieve some buddies online at the same time the enemy appeared on the scene, that I'd come up and close the penetration behind them, and that the beautifully detailed map of our position, both fighting and rear, which undoubtedly had been made with inside information, probably one of the Korean labourers was a spy, and which we found on one of the dead was a direct replica not of our position but of Joe Love's when we'd relieved him 2 weeks before. The major lessons learned concerned sleepers, smokers, and sloppy procedures, henceforth following the lead of Red Smalling in the Easy Company days. Sleepers would have the beat out of them by their leaders' cigarettes, which could be seen for miles, were as good as an engraved invitation to the enemy to come and get me. So from that moment forward, smoking was prohibited from sunset to sunrise anywhere on the hill. The rule applied to chain smoking me too, and there were to be no exceptions. Even within the deepest, safest bunkers on the reverse slope, transgressors would meet the same fate as the sleepers. It had been sloppy not to inspect the Easy Company tie-in position every time we checked our line. If I'd been the 3rd platoon leader, I was sure Mock would have done so. At least I thought I would, but as company commander I definitely should have. So this was as much my fault as Stokes's henceforth. Though it would be the rule, we also placed tactical barbed wire, complete with mines and flares, along our reverse slope boundary with a company. This caused quite a row between me and the Iasco. But I wouldn't bend. I was rarely burned more than once during the attack. The guys of 3rd platoon had bunched up 5 and 6 guys in bunkers designed for 2. It was a natural herd instinct I'd seen a million times, but it might have been prevented had a local counter-attack force been appointed the moment we got on the hill, and the guys trained accordingly. It should have been SOP instead, more sloppiness on both Stokes and my parts. And worse for me, because I should have known better after the wounded had been evacuated. I went back to my CP to record the action, the mistakes, the casualties, the lessons learned. My little book would be a valuable teaching aid. I'd go over it with the troops, and when we got into reserve, we'd go over it again and again. But I did not write down my own mistakes. I didn't have to, for all the work we'd done for how on top of things I'd been feeling that such a thing should happen, and why I was sick, guilty, and ashamed. My own lesson learned was indelibly etched in my brain, the image of 2 dead soldiers whom I'd known were irresponsible, yet whom I tasked with the safety of my unit. I'd violated security and sent them to their deaths. Haley, the 3rd man, was the only soldier ever captured from my command. He was released some months later as part of Operation Little Switch, but the tragic unnecessary losses, a direct result of the worst command decision I would ever make, were crosses I would bear for the rest of my life. Happy birthday, Hack. How's it feel to be 22 other documents found on the Kia, with the map? He'd most likely been the CEO of the raiding party. caused higher headquarters to believe a major North Korean attack was imminent. Nothing came of it, but it was good psychological warfare complement of the enemy. Sometimes these sorts of documents had exact dates and times which kept us on our toes and higher-ups milling around the position. In the meantime, we rebuilt and reorganized, starting with the piss tubes the 11th of November. North Korean raiders had grenaded out, and what was probably the only humorous moment of the whole affair. We used metal, 105 ammo canisters, both for stovepipes and urinals. The piss tubes were dug into gravel pits with lime all around them, and were interspersed with the stovepipes of the sleeping and warming bunkers. Throughout the platoon's reverse slope positions, the North Koreans must have been drilled that a tube sticking out of the ground meant a stove, which in turn meant a bunker, which meant throw a grenade down there and blow it all up. Stokes had seen one enemy send down a grenade, only to have it blow up at his feet, killing him instantly and showering him with Yankee piss. Guess the North Koreans didn't know Indian folklore. American braves always said the white man pissed too close to his own teepee. We absorbed new replacements, many of whom were combat ready for a change. I had a lock on good people through Boyd Guttery, who'd left as one of Fighter's platoon leaders to be the regimental personnel officer. He was a good man I'd fought to keep when he was ordered back. Though I'd lost that battle, I'd won the war because Boyd sent us the best former Trieste studs like SFC Sioux and PFC Maguire, as well as airborne ranger types, Korean returnees like Lindemann and my favourites of them all, good old country boys from the hills of Kentucky, Tennessee and Virginia, who unlike all the city boys had grown up with a weapon in their hands and took to combat like Alvin York. Danny Forrester from Tennessee was one of these. He was absolutely fearless, and with him, ex-187th man, Bob Gruber and Uno Rentmeister, an ex-82nd man who reminded me of Jimmy Mamura. He could walk through unpacked snow without leaving a trace. I had the basis for the best of Fighters' recon patrol teams. Uno Rentmeister was probably the deadliest weapon fighter had against the North Koreans, basically. Because unlike the National Guardsmen and Dreys in the company, he believed Uno had grown up in Estonia. As a child, he'd seen what the Russians did to his homeland and that of the neighbouring Finns, and at 20 he hated all communists, and what they represented, I felt a little bit different than a lot of the guys Uno would say years later. I volunteered to go to Korea and fight the communists, and most of the Dreys were thinking about going home, but that's why I'm here, and so many of them are buried. Uno was a small guy, completely at home in the dark snowy woods. He knew how to dress lightly, and was able to train his fellow patrolmen in this and other subtleties of the dangerous. The one he'd made a combat jump with the 187th Airborne RCT on a previous tour, white-black Puerto Rican, or green, that was no small thing, and under his leadership, the new Puerto Rican platoon, which wasn't nearly platoon-sized, but it sounded good, became a great fighting force almost overnight, just as the Koreans became under Sergeant Chung. Sometimes all the motivation a guy needs is a little respect, and a damn good leader who shares common ground, even before the big influx of replacements. The leaders I'd inherited had begun to show their true capable colours. Gregory, my top, was damn smart, and growing into his position every day. Fighters' platoon sergeants Hudson, Allison and Smith were magic on patrol, and doing fine with their acting master sergeant roles too, though I had no power to promote acting or otherwise above corporal in the Raiders. I'd organised promoteen for Jimmy Mamura and other deserving guys through Colonel Sloan. I got the stripes and had the guys sew them on as if they were the real thing. Authorised permanent stripes did come down from regiment each month. So over their time, Fighter, the guys would one by one start getting paid in accordance with what they were wearing on their sleeves. But in the meantime, my acting promotion scheme worked wonders. Within days, each man and his respective unit were functioning like they'd been at it for months. We were not the best yet, but we were getting there. The sterner, the challenge said Tuan be the finer, the response, and it impressed the visitors too to see all these senior NCOs in one little company, but we were still a bit green in the great scheme of things, so I was elated when Colonel Locke rang to say he was sending me his sergeant major. I couldn't believe my luck. I remembered the guy. He was a young parachute master sergeant, a walking recruitment poster, great. I said, "I'll make him my first sergeant." "No," replied Locke. "I want him busted. He's no goddamn good. I'm sending him to you because you're the hardest guy I've got. I want him to be a private within a month. Bust him for inefficiency." A few hours later, a short, blonde-haired, bluey-byed All-American stud by the name of John Westmoreland walked into my CP. I explained to him that the colonel wanted his stripes and asked why he was on Locke's list. Well, Sir Westmoreland began with a wonderful Tennessee twang. "You know the colonel has a mighty wild temper," and went on to tell me it had all started the day before when Locke's field telephone at Battalion CP wouldn't work. The colonel had flown into a rage and thrown down the phone. It broke. He'd snapped at Westy to get him another one. And though Westy was not the comm sergeant, far be it from him to disobey an order during a tantrum, the second phone hadn't worked either, and according to Westy, Locke had gotten so mad he'd taken a swing at his sergeant major. But Westmoreland, who'd been middleweight champ of the 82nd Airborne Division, had just stepped back and cleaned Locke's clock in the middle of the command bunker, with the rest of the CP group sitting at ringside. I now understood why Locke wanted him reduced. I also knew I'd do everything in my power to make sure it didn't happen. The colonel had had the right idea to send Westy to the line, but he'd picked the wrong co to bust his ass. The challenge was just too great to resist. Westmoreland had no infantry experience. He'd been trained as a medic and worked his way up to sergeant major of a medical battalion at Fort Bragg before being transferred to our infantry unit, but he was very sharp and I could tell he was a good man. So the first thing I did with his consent was make him an assistant squad leader. This was 3 big steps down for a master sergeant, but the guy was willing. I told him I'd work with him and instruct his platoon leader and sergeant to do the same. The fact was I'd been down the same road myself in both the Recon and George companies. Someone had always seen potential and taken me under his wing, but I'd had to prove myself on the ground before I got any real responsibility. I'd continued the tradition in the Raiders. NG Bill Smith got a lot of attention from the rest of us, and he proved himself a fine young leader. Like Smith, Westy had all the makings, he just needed the techniques. So every night when I walked the line, I made a point of seeing him in his squad sector. I'd fight him through hypothetical attacks, deploying mythical men and machine guns, until he got a feel for the game. Most of it was common sense, anyway. Westy was just one more act to juggle, in many ways the easiest, because he was alert and eager to learn. Maybe it was because he'd been a medic. He had intuitive understanding of the tides of battle and a heightened sensitivity to the needs of his fellow troopers, and that was far more than could be said for many men, both on the line and at the regimental country club. During this period we found ourselves inundated with inspectors. The only good reason I could find for this was that higher headquarters had nothing else to do. The stagnant Korean War presented many problems for the army, not least of which was a whole bunch of rear echelon staff officers working in headquarters that were designed to move, but with nowhere to move to. So these officers were made inspectors and then sent traying off to the trenches to look at the way we lived. And for morale purposes, I guess they were supposed to help us. Not only did they inspect our food, our bunkers and our weapons, they inspected our teeth too. Yes, dentists would visit the frontline positions and wake troopers who'd been up all night pulling guard or on patrol to examine their teeth. That kind of help we didn't need. Morale could have been lifted far better if they just stayed away and let us sleep. Another innovation in this trench war was the Korean Certificate of Loss. KCEL, we were told that Congress concerned about army waste had adopted the KCL as a watchdog mechanism. Anything that was lost in the trenches or in combat with a value of $50 or more had to be accounted for by a certificate signed by the company battalion and regimental COSOS. Not only did this mean an enormous amount of paperwork at the company level, the last thing we needed as we attempted to fight a war, but it also made liars out of us all in fighter. We blamed, for example, the problems of a 6-man patrol for the loss of more gear than would be carried by a platoon, including the otherwise unexplainable disappearance of 2 kitchen fire units. Even the regimental coups knew this. From time to time, our KCLs were sent back with a note to find a better story to cover a loss unacceptable under the KCL rules, how this was supposed to jive with an officer's integrity. I didn't know from Congress to the boys in the trenches, the war had become a useless drain, not just of resources but of credibility, and why the higher-ups didn't just end the thing was beyond everyone's comprehension.